Welcome everyone as you join today's webinar. We usually allow a minute or so at the start of these sessions for people to join. So if you would wait with me for a minute or so while everybody joining can log on, and then we'll get started with today's session. But welcome, great to have you here today for this webinar. Just a quick reminder again to those of you joining, we're just allowing another minute for everybody to log on before we get started with the session today. So thanks for your patience while we wait for everyone to join us. Okay, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us at today's Changing Point webinar. Today's webinar is on the topic of From Resistance to Engagement, the secret to driving successful change. And for those of you who are joining Changing Point webinar for the first time, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jayne Ruff. I'm a chartered coaching and occupational psychologist and also the managing director here at Changing Point. And my passion for supporting individuals, teams and organizations through times of change comes from both that professional background as a psychologist and also my own personal experiences of being a part of change in the workplace and how it feels to be a part of change in the workplace, from mergers to restructures, times of organizational growth to downsizing and redundancies. And over the last 15 years, I have been working with organizations across sectors of different sizes, across different geographical locations, to support and promote positive behavioural change at an individual, team and organisational cultural level. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing with you today some of the research, the insights and the tools that I've used over the years with my clients to support them in leading change, and hopefully also to support you as leaders today in turning change resistance to engagement. There will be a Q&A section in today's webinar at the end. So please, as we go through the session, if a question does come to mind, share it in the Q&A box, and I will come to that at the end of the webinar. If we don't have time to cover all questions live today, then we will be following up with written responses to the questions as part of the follow-up from today's session. So please do keep an eye out for that email coming after the webinar today. It's going to be a very practical session today. So we're going to be focusing on the different strategies and actionable steps that you can take as a change leader in your organization to bring people positively and collaboratively with you on your change journey. And to support with that, to join the dots between the content that we're going to be covering today and the changes that you are currently navigating as a leader within your organization, what I'd encourage you to do now is just bring to mind your thoughts and reflections on the following two questions. What changes are you and your team readily accepting? And what changes are you and your team strongly resisting? Why is that? What thoughts come to mind when you sit back and reflect on these two questions? Bring your thoughts and reflections on these two questions with you as we go through today's webinar. And I'll signpost along the way where it might be helpful to bring them to the front of your minds as we think about how we can put some of the tools and techniques that we're covering today into practice. So if we look at some of the recent change research, when we look at what makes employees most resistant to change, one of the themes that we often see at the top of the list is around trust, whether that's mistrust in an organisation or a feeling of mistrust towards leadership driving the change at the top of the organisation. And if we start to dig a little bit deeper into some of the other factors that show up in the change research around what makes people resistant to change, we can start to get a little bit of insight into where some of the trust issues might come from. So if we look at the lack of awareness around the reason for change, the importance of clarity around the purpose for change and the why, and then also that fear of the unknown, that anxiety that people can experience when there's uncertainty about the role that they are playing within the change and the change journey. So with this in mind, the question then becomes, how can we as leaders build and maintain trust during times of change and uncertainty, taking into account some of the issues around the need to have that clarity of communication and have that sense of connection in order to be able to turn that resistance into engagement? My perspective in answer to this question is that we need to be thinking about change leadership and emotional intelligence as two fundamentally intertwined factors when we think about what makes change leadership successful today. When it comes to building trust, we know from the research that emotional intelligence plays a really crucial role when we're communicating through change. And that occurs at two different levels. So we know that we need to be thinking about how we communicate a clear change vision and united direction of travel. And then also, and importantly, we need to be understanding and tuning into some of the emotional and psychological factors that underpin change acceptance and commitment across the business. So having that clear and consistent message from the top of the organisation isn't enough for us to get that genuine engagement and overcome that resistance to change. We also need to be thinking about and tuning into those emotional and psychological factors that we know push that engagement to the next level and support that genuine change acceptance and commitment. And emotional intelligence and building the confidence and capability of our leaders in tapping into key emotional intelligence competencies plays a really important part in this. So let's explore what building and developing some of these leadership, emotional and intelligence competencies looks like now. There are a couple of competencies that I would like to introduce to you today and for us to think about in terms of our change leadership communication. And those are empathy and straightforwardness, and how we get the balance right. What we tend to find in our work with leaders is that when it comes to our change communication, there can be more of a leaning towards one side of the scale over the other. And that leaning may differ from individual to individual. There might be a general leaning to one side of the scale over the other when we think about how we're leading collectively as a team as well. If that balance is more in favour of straightforwardness, then we as an individual leader or as a collective leadership group may feel more comfortable and demonstrate more competence in line with having change messages that are assertive, that are delivered in a confident and very direct way. And of course, we need that. We need those essential skills to make sure that we're delivering that clear and consistent communication. But if it comes at the cost of empathy, and we're not thinking about the empathy side of the balance enough in our change leadership communication, then we might struggle to tap into some of those underlying psychological and emotional factors that we talked about being essential to getting that change, acceptance, and engagement. We can actually see this play out in the assessment of leadership emotional intelligence, which is something that we do as part of our ChangingPoint Universal Change Leadership programs. And we've got a snapshot here of one of the assessment tools that we use in these programs. So that imbalance between straightforwardness and empathy is measurable, which means that we're also able to target some of the specific change leadership behaviours that we need to develop either at an individual or a team level, and then measure our progress towards developing those competencies too. As is often the case when it comes to developing these competencies, often it's the small behavioural changes that we're looking to try and make and build momentum on over time. And if we think about that within the context of building empathy, one of the things that we often talk about when we're working with leaders and we're working with leadership teams around building empathy is a recognition of the importance of pace and space. So when we're driving change, in order to ensure that we're getting that balance right with empathy, we need to be thinking about, are we creating a pace where there's an opportunity to slow things down and create a space where we are genuinely listening, and we're listening to understand, we're being curious, and we're creating a space where people can discuss openly and honestly how they're feeling about the change and the impact that it's having on them. So that might be looking at some of the meetings that we're introducing to support the change and the change follow through, and ensuring that we've got the right pace and space to support empathy. It might be thinking about actually shifting the structure of those meetings. So some of those meetings are more team-led than leader-led. But thinking about how we bring that pace and space into the change leadership journey to support that empathy as part of getting the balance right in our communication is key. Now, of course, the balance can flip the other way too. So we might see the scales start to tip more towards empathy than straightforwardness. And if our energy and attention as a leader or as a leadership group is weighted more heavily towards empathy, then we might be doing a very good job at seeking to understand and connect with others' feelings. But we might be finding it more challenging to deliver that direct communication that we know is needed to drive change and create that united and clear direction of travel, that change momentum that's going to drive change success and drive that change forward. Now, again, that imbalance is measurable and can be identified, explored, and evaluated through the assessment of a leadership emotional intelligence and through looking at a leader's current levels of emotional intelligence. And when we think about what this might look like in practice and how we would support recalibrating this balance, so we've got the balance right between straightforwardness and empathy, it might be supporting an individual leader or a leadership team to think about how they are structuring and approaching their change communication. So really thinking about the planning of change communication, the contents of that change communication, and then effective change communication follow through. I worked with a one-to-one client recently where this became a very interesting conversation as part of our coaching session, where we had used leadership emotional intelligence assessment at a 360 level to try and understand where her strengths and areas for development were and how they were perhaps contributing to the successes and the challenges that she was having as a change leader. Now, in particular, one of the things that she highlighted in our sessions was that she felt she was struggling to connect and get the buy-in and engagement of particular direct reports within her team around the change that she was looking to implement. And that change was part of a wider vision and strategy change across the organisation. Now, when we talked through the approach that she was taking with her team, she recognized that she was spending a lot of time listening to them. She was taking a very much a coaching approach to her one-to-ones with team members and was giving them a lot of space and time to share how they were feeling. So that empathy was definitely there. And when we looked at the results from the 360, her results validated that as well. So she was very much high on the empathy score, and the written feedback that was included highlighted the listening skills as a strength that she was bringing. What it also highlighted, though, was that there was a development need around straightforwardness, which was interesting because what it allowed us to think about and explore was actually based on what her team needed from her right now as a change leader, where would it be beneficial for her to dial up that straightforwardness and perhaps even dial down some of that empathy in order to get the balance right. So the conclusion that she reached was what the team was missing from her, in particular, direct reports in particular, was clarity around the role that they played and the direction of travel that the team was going in and how that aligned to the wider vision and strategy changes that were underway across the wider organisation. So it was a real case for building some of the skills and the skill set required to demonstrate that straightforwardness competency as a leader, and it changed her approach to how she was communicating on a one-to-one and group level with her team. So we need to be thinking about then, in order to communicate our change vision with a united direction of travel and also to understand and tune into those psychological and emotional factors that we know influence change, acceptance, and commitment, how we are developing and demonstrating both the empathy and the straightforwardness sides of the scales, thinking about what that looks like at an individual level, where our strengths lie on across the balance at the moment, and where we might need to focus our own individual leadership development. And then also thinking about what that balance looks like at a collective leadership team level as well. Is there a tip more towards one side or the other? How do you get the balance right at different stages of the change process? And if we just briefly link this back into trust then, and how empathy and straightforwardness sit within building trust as a leader, we recognize, and we do a lot of work with individuals and teams to develop each of the points of the trust triangle here. So we're looking to build that leadership authenticity, that straightforwardness, and that empathy, because we know that by building those emotional intelligence competencies, we are going to support leaders in building that trusted leadership, to communicate with clarity, and to really invest in and give that attention to building the relationship skills that are needed to get that engagement across the wider team. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is briefly talk us through a model called the Change House, which is taken from a psychologist called Klaus Janssen, which is a model that I often use as a tool to help leaders think about and raise awareness of the different transitions that we go through individually and as a team when we are experiencing change, and how to use this to get that balance right, to bring both empathy and straightforwardness into our change leadership communication. So a quick reminder here at this point to bring back into the front of your mind some of those reflections and thoughts that you had in relation to those two questions at the start of the webinar today. What changes are you and your team readily accepting, and what changes are you and your team strongly resisting? Keep those thoughts and reflections in mind as we go through the Change House and think about perhaps where this tool could support you in addressing some of those thoughts and reflections in your change leadership journey. So there are 4 rooms to the Change House, and we're going to start off in the room of contentment. Now, the room of contentment, or another way of looking at this would be our current world, perhaps even our comfort zone, is often where we might not necessarily be seeing the obvious need for change. At times it can be that we get a little bit tunnel focused in this room. So we're focused on the day job, and that tunnel vision prevents us from seeing the wider change on the horizon, or the change opportunities to take advantage of. And when we are in that room of contentment, or even basking on the sun balcony, We may then be unprepared for change when it comes. We're lacking that important change readiness that allows us to have that adaptability, another key emotional intelligence skill, and that readiness to respond to change in the moment. We might also miss the opportunities to embrace change and development and continuous improvement. So if we think about this within the context of our role as change leaders, providing clarity around the need for constant change readiness and role modeling that through curiosity, seeking ideas for change and improvement, even within the room of contentment from across the team, are really important qualities to be demonstrating as a leader in order to ensure that we are bringing both that straightforwardness and that empathy to life, even when we're not in a live change scenario, so to speak. Once we have left the room of contentment, we enter into the room of denial. And at this point, our sense of normality is suddenly disrupted. And so we have a whole host of different feelings and emotions that will present themselves when we enter into the room of denial, in part because that sense of normality being disrupted means that the uncertainty is going to result in us trying to hold on to the old and the familiar, the comfort zone. If it's left unaddressed, we might find ourselves or our team entering into the dungeon of denial, and it is a much harder place to overcome that resistance and get engagement and acceptance when we slip into that dungeon of denials. That's definitely something to be avoided. So our leadership role in supporting people through the room of denial, first and foremost, one of the key things that we need to be bringing here is listening, to hear concerns and to acknowledge the different emotions and feelings that are presenting themselves around the change. That listening is such a fundamental part of leadership empathy. And I think it's also a skill that we tend to think we're better at than we really are. Really good listening takes considered effort and practice in order to get it to that level where we're truly listening with empathy as a leader. So really thinking about and developing our listening skills individually and as a leadership team is important in the room of denial. We also need to be creating those psychologically safe spaces where people feel that they can talk openly and honestly about the change. And that might require us to show a bit of vulnerability as leaders too, so that we're role modeling that vulnerability. And we can do that by admitting how we feel and what we don't know, as well as what we do know, in order to provide that clarity where possible. And then helping people to see alternative possibilities. So using that straightforwardness here, that clarity of communication, to help them see other ways of viewing the change, clearly articulating those reasons for change so that you understand why it's happening. So from the room of denial, we move into the room of confusion. And at that point, there is an acceptance that the old world is no longer relevant, but there is also a continued sense of uncertainty as people try and find their place in that new world, because we do all have a need for a sense of purpose and control as human beings. Now, if that is left unaddressed, people may take one of two routes. They may enter into the paralysis pit, so they don't know how to engage in the change and therefore they do nothing. Or they might take the alternative direction door, so they seek that clarity around their sense of purpose from elsewhere and they leave the organisation, which is obviously particularly problematic if we start to lose talent from the team as part of this process. So again, thinking about our leadership role here and how it relates to demonstrating empathy and straightforwardness in practice, we need to be thinking about regular communication and frequency of contact to ensure that that clarity and alignment is there and that we're addressing any assumptions being made around the change. We want to make sure that we're not assuming that what has been communicated before So in particular, when people may well have been in the room of denial, has been heard, or it's been heard as we needed it to be. So we need to use that leadership empathy to recognize that people's feelings at the time of the change announcement and as changes progressed may have influenced their levels of engagement in the messaging. And so as a result, we may need to repeat and reframe some of that messaging as we go to help them move their levels of engagement on now. Continuing to recognize and celebrate the small wins, again, is really important within that room of confusion, to recognize the individual roles that people have played as part of the change, to recognize the roles that teams have played as part of the change. And that taps into both that straightforwardness and empathy. So it's empathizing with the importance that people have on needing to feel valued and to feel a part of the change, and also to give that clarity that progress is being made, and that the change is moving in the right direction. And then finally, we enter into the room of renewal. So continuing to provide that clarity of direction through regular two-way communication, as well as developing and demonstrating our empathy here as leaders by recognizing that not everyone will be in the same room as us. Quite often we move through these rooms quicker as leaders because we have been working on and privy to the changes sooner and earlier than our teams. So we need to use our empathy to recognize and understand that, and recognize, therefore, that our team may have different support needs depending on the room that they are in. Both that straightforwardness and empathy are going to continue to be important leadership skills for us to bring and demonstrate in the room of renewal. Now, the Change House journey is not a linear process, so we can swing backwards and forwards between these rooms as we go, which again is why bringing leadership straightforwardness and empathy into how we are managing our teams through this Change House is so important, so that we can recognize and pick up on where different members of our team are across the Change House at any moment in time. And then we can use that straightforwardness as well to help navigate and direct them to the next room with clarity and consistency. So taking a moment for reflection now, I'd encourage you to think about which Change House room you are in today, and think about what that looks like for you, how you're experiencing change, how you're feeling about the change. And then consider how you will use both empathy and straightforwardness and the skills that empathy and straightforwardness offer us in terms of our change leadership communication to bring others with you on the change journey and turn any change resistance that we are picking up on along the way into engagement. So I'd encourage you to spend some time reflecting on that after today's session and think about how you can put some of those key skills into practice. Now, I briefly mentioned earlier our Universal Change Leadership Programme, and I wanted to just briefly introduce you to the science that underpins that programme and the success of that programme, which all centres around the framework that you can see on the slide here now. So we have developed a framework called the Universal Change Leadership Framework, which develops a broad range of social and emotional skills that we know are essential to developing change leadership competence and confidence. And we deliver that programme in a series of different ways, through workshops, through group coaching, through one-to-one coaching, and using various different assessments and tools along the way as well. We're not only able to measure some of the behavioural change impact of these programmes through the assessment tools that I shared earlier, but also importantly, one of the things that we're always looking to do is try and assess the wider business impact in our programmes as well. So I just wanted to, again, very briefly share an example of that with you now. where one recent program where we were working with an operations board to build their leadership skills, where we'd seen previously consistent levels of staff turnover at around 30%, which had been attributed to a certain extent to unhelpful leadership behaviours that were recognised to be driving some silo behaviour and impacting the wider organisational culture. We saw that 30% figure reduced to 16% post-programme, which the business equated to a cost saving of around £1 million per annum. So we were able to quantify that as part of the programme and how it supported the successful change for that particular organisation. So, of course, we'd be delighted to have a chat around how the Universal Change Leadership Programme might be able to support you as an individual leader or your organisation more broadly after today's session. So please do let us know if that is something that you would like to learn more about. But for now, it would be great to move into our Q&A session. And if you do have a question and you've not yet had the opportunity to type it into the chat box, please do so now. And we will spend some time answering any questions that you have. And I'll just check what we've got in the chat box now. So one question that I can see here around, let me have a look. So yes, how do we recognise and acknowledge resistance to change at the senior leadership team level, and what can we do to tackle it? Okay, so that is a good question, because we do want to make sure that when we're thinking about addressing resistance to engagement, that we do have the buy-in that we need from the top, and not just buy-in, but actually alignment at the top of the organisation as well. So making sure that we're not making any assumptions around the alignment that we do have at the senior level within the organisation. So one way that we would support, or we support in unearthing any resistance at the senior leadership team level, would be to actually give senior leaders the opportunity to complete something like our Universal Change Leadership Assessment Tool, which asks them to share against that model where they see the collective change leadership strengths and where they see the challenges. And through that process, we're then able to identify any themes that are coming up across the group and any points of difference, and facilitate a very open and honest discussion around that. For anyone who joined us recently on the webinar that we ran with the Managing Director of Allied Vehicles Group, Peter Facena, he talked quite a lot about where that process had supported him and his senior leadership team in actually having some discussions that had previously not been raised as a group, and actually just that process of gathering feedback and insights through a survey opened up a conversation and opened up some of the challenges that people were feeling but perhaps hadn't openly articulated, in a way that allowed them to work through those challenges, align and move forward. So I think the key thing is just not making, again, an assumption that senior leaders are aligned, and creating pace and space for them to explore how they're feeling about the change, where they see the strengths and the challenges being in terms of the approach that they're taking as a leadership team towards change. And then through that, ensure that you've got that alignment and an agreement on the way forward. Any other questions before we close off today's session? It looks like the chat box has gone quiet. So if any questions do come to mind after the session, please do drop me a note. Oh, we have one question come in. So how do you strike the right balance between allowing people to surface their emotional negative feelings about change and move people to the room of renewal? Great question. Thank you, Charlotte. It is absolutely a balance. And I think that is where that balance of empathy and straightforwardness, having those two competencies working together is crucial. Because if we have as I said, the balance too much focused on the empathy side, where we're spending a lot of time thinking about and unearthing the feelings around change without having the clarity of direction on how we're moving forward, then that actually isn't going to support us in getting that change momentum that we need to move into the room of renewal. So my suggestion on that would be that the process that you're taking to support people to surface those feelings is clearly shared. So there is a process for how we're going to approach ensuring that we've got the space to share how we're feeling, to share those negative emotions that we might be experiencing as part of change. And then we're also going to agree a process for how we address those feelings and then move forward. So I think the clarity of communication around that process is really important, and that getting that balance right between that empathy and straightforwardness there is going to be really critical. Making sure that you're using the straightforwardness as a way of providing clarity on how those feelings that have been shared are going to be heard and used, and also providing clarity around where we need to move forward and what needs to happen next. So getting that empathy and straightforwardness balance right there is going to be key. Thank you, Charlotte, for your question. Okay, at this point, I will thank everyone for their input to today's session. It's been great to have you join us. Thank you so much. Do please let me know if any other questions come up. Drop me an email after today's session. I'd be delighted to answer them. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope to see you at a future Changing Point webinar soon. Thank you.